Okay, we are continuing today, Eretz Hashem, and Daf Chaf Zayin 27. We are picking up at the two dots on Chaf Vav Amud Beis 26b Amar Ula, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines up from the bottom. Amar Ula. Ilan asamach lameitza b'soshesh ama gazlanu. So Ulan said that if I plant a tree within 16 amas of my friend's field, so remember again, based on what we saw in the previous daf, so the first 16 amas of the root system provide nourishment and nutrition to the tree. So the problem is that if I plant a tree within 16 amas of my friend's field, that means my roots are extending into his field and taking up nutrients from his field. As a result, gazlanhu, such a person is a thief, ve'in mevinim mimena bikurim, and we don't bring bikurim from such a tree. So really a tremendous statement. And Rashi points out over here, what's the reason for that? Because the pasuk by bikurim says, Asher tavi me'artzecha. You bring first fruits from your land, fruits that grow on your land. But since technically speaking, this tree, even though this tree is situated in my land, but the roots are deriving nourishment from someone else's field, therefore I do not bring bikurim. Incredible. So Gemara says, how does Ula know that the tree derives its nourishment from the first 16 amas? Perhaps to say from the following halacha, from the following mishnah. If you have 10 saplings that are dispersed or scattered within an area of a beis sa'ah, called beis sa'ah b'shvilan ad Rosh Hashanah. You can go ahead and literally plow the entire beis sa'ah for the benefit of these saplings up until Rosh Hashanah. Now, a little bit of context here. Take a look at Rashi. So Rashi explains, it's actually quite interesting. Rashi says, the arko l'rachbo, aser netios mifuzar beis sa'ah, kulam b'shavi yonkos mikol beis sa'ah, v'kulam tzarech lahem, umuter l'charsho erev shvius, ad Rosh Hashanah, shalach ala Moshe misinai hu beis sa'ah chamishim ama sha'achasam mishkan. Okay, so let me just say this outside. The halacha is like this. Already, you're not allowed, there are already certain. Okay, let's take a step back. During the Shemitah year, one is not permitted to work the field. Already in the 6th year, there are certain things you cannot do if they are directly viewed as preparing the field for use during the Shemitah year. However, you could do certain cultivational activities that benefit the current growth. So therefore, for example, over here, the Mishnah says that if you have 10 saplings spread out in an area of a beis sa'ah, you can go ahead and plow the entire beis sa'ah up until Rosh Hashanah of the Shemitah year, because that benefits the saplings themselves. Kamal havalu. So if you have 10 saplings in an area of a beis sa'ah, how much space is that? So the Gemara says, Trei alfin v'chamish garmidi l'chol chad v'chad. That's 250 amas for each tree. The problem with that is matilei mason v'chamshin halo havidu ula. Here's the problem. The problem is an area of ultimately, again, that's 2,500 square feet, 2,500 amas, which gives each sapling 250 amas. The problem is that according to Ula, if you understand that the root systems extend 16 amas out in each direction, then that should require really 1,024 amas. The elami distan. So remember again, we're just trying to figure out where does Ula get this idea that the primary root system, which nourishes the tree, extends out 16 amas. Rather, we'll learn it from the following. Shloshi lanos shal gimel b'nei adam hare elu mitzarfin v'charshin kol beis sa'ah b'shvilan. So another case over here, another Shemitah case. So I have trees that belong to 3 different people. So all of these are mitzarfin. They ultimately, again, all combine. V'charshin kol beis sa'ah b'shvilan. You could thresh or you could plow the entire beis sa'ah because of them. Take a look at Rashi. The element is nan shloshei lanos kidolim shiyon kin yosem in anatios mufuzar beis sa'ah la'arko u'lerachba b'shava. Alpha P Sheno Shaldam Echad El Shoshosh Bnei Adam Mitzarfin Leo Sada Ilan Valachrosh Kol Beis Sa'ah B'Shvilan Erev Shvius Ad Atzeres. So here's what's interesting. In this case, without getting into all of the details, these 3 trees belong to 3 different people, but because they are all situated within the same beis sa'ah, therefore halacha l'maisa, again, they combine to form a sada ilan, like an orchard. And because they form an orchard, the halacha is that you're permitted to work the land of an orchard up until b'shilan erev shvius adat seres, up until Shavuos. Kedin sada ilan ve'im lav in charshin elakol echa v'echa gedei tzarcho then utakta v'chutzalo. So again, the halacha is, so if you have 3 of these larger trees, these are ilanos, as opposed to before I'm talking about saplings. These are larger trees which occupy more space. So 3 larger trees in a beis sa'ah form a sadeh ilan, an orchard, and therefore that area could be worked up until Shavuos of year number 6. Okay, so top of Chav Zayin, the Kama Havalu. So how much is that area? Trei Alfi Vehe Mea Garmidi Lechol Chad V'Chad. Ultimately, again, that will create 2,500 amas. So the Gemara says, "Matile tamni mea utlas nutlas betulsa." The problem is left over from that. You'll have 833 and a third. Akati nafish le deula, still ula's shear. Remember again, ula require. If it's true that the root systems could potentially extend 16 amas out in every direction, you're going to need 1,024 amas. This is still too little. To which the Gemara says, lo duck. You're right, Ula was not precise with his calculations. So when he said 16 amas, he didn't mean exactly 16 amas. So first of all, again, in general, when we say lo duck, that a person is not precise, that could only be used when there's a chumrah. L'kula lo dak mi aminan. Ultimately, again, but for a leniency. Now, again, remember the leniency in this case over here is that Ula would say, for example, again, if the roots extend, if I plant my tree within 16 amas of my friend's field, I don't have to bring bikurim. So again, ultimately, this could be a kula. To which the Gemara says, "Michti kama." To which the Gemara says, "I'm sorry, mi savis peribua karminan." Do you think we're talking about a square? Be'igula karmina, we're talking about a circle. I says the Gemara, Michte kamru b'yosal eagle. So how much larger is a square than a circle? Revia, quarter. Therefore, pashlu zayin meos v'shisin v'tamnie. So therefore, again, you'll have left over 768 amas. Akati, pashle palgadam sa'ai, but that leaves you with 16, that gives you a shear for the roots of 16 and a half amas, not 16. Hainu de lo dak ula chumra lo dak. To which the Gemara says, that's what it means when it says that Ula was not precise. So Ula said 16, but he was machmir. Really, the real shear ultimately, again, is 16 and a half. Okay. Tashma. I will say, so again, the point to remember in all of this is not necessarily all the mathematical calculations. The point to remember in all of this is that Ula goes with this idea, like the Gemara said before, that a tree is nourished from the first 16 amos of roots. Okay, that seems to be an agreed upon principle. Based on that, Ula says you are not allowed to plant your tree within 16 amas of someone else's field. And if you do so, therefore, again, that means my root system of my tree is going to grow into Rulin's field. I am a thief. Now, again, what are the ramifications of being a thief? Number one, it's not good to be a thief, so you don't want to be called a thief. Number two, the Gemara says one would not bring bikurim from such produce, assuming that, let's say, again, the tree that I planted, let's say I planted an olive tree, so it's one of the 7 species, one of the shivas aminim, from which you bring bikurim. I would not bring bikurim from such a thing because, again, it's stolen property. So this is a pretty major thing. So the Gemara now quotes another opinion. The Gemara says as follows: Tashma, hakone ilan v'karko. If a person purchases a tree and ultimately it's karka with it, so I purchase a tree and the land, maybe the kore. Ultimately, I bring bikurim and I recite the psukim. Now, again, this is an interesting discussion that comes up in Mishnayos and Bikurim, that there are certain times, ultimately, again, where you bring Bikurim, but you don't necessarily read the psukim. There's like a kriya, a reading that is done together with the Bikurim. So again, we'll get to that later on. But again, a person goes ahead, I purchase a tree and the karka, so now, in that case, I bring Bikurim and I do the associated readings. My love, kolshu. Are we not talking about where I bought any amount of land, even a very small amount of land? So you see from here that it's not a problem if the root system extends into someone else's land. No, tezayin amma. No, the Gemara says, no. It's actually going 16 amas. 16 amas. Okay. So Tashma, Kana, Shnei Ilanos Beso Shal Chaveiro, maybe Ve'ena Kore. So you gross another case. I buy 2 trees within my friend's field. I bring Bikurim, but I do not do the recitation. Hashlosha maybe Vikore. Now, the reason for that is because the purchase of 2 trees does not automatically give you land. Really, that could be viewed as purchasing trees. I own the trees, but someone else owns the land. However, Hashlosha maybe Vikore. If I were to purchase 3 trees, the purchase of 3 trees comes with the associated land, and therefore I bring the Bikurim, and I would also go ahead and do the kriya. So the Gemara says, "My love kolshu." We're not talking about where you're buying any amount of land. In other words, the point the Gemara is trying to make is the Gemara is trying to disprove ula and trying to show that I could own a tree even on a very small amount of land, which by definition means that my root system is extending into my friend's property. To which the Gemara says, "No, hachanami." So to over here, tes zayin amas. We're talking about again 16 amas. So you purchase when we say that you own the land, we mean you own the 16 amas around. Okay, Tashma. Rabbi Akiva says, "Karka kol shu chai bepeah or bebikurim the kol sanala pruzbal." So this is actually quite beautiful. Rabbi Akiva says that any amount of land is chayiv in peah. Remember again, peah is the amount is when you have to go out and leave a corner of your field, and bikurim. Now again we'll get to the rest of this, but I just want to mention something amazing. And yesterday I was in Tiberia, and Baruch Hashem I had the opportunity to daven by Rabbi Akiva's kever. And one of the most incredible things, so many incredible things about Rabbi Akiva, but one of the most beautiful and incredible things is Rabbi Akiva is the one who teaches us to maximize our current circumstances, whatever it is, right? So again, we know the famous story at the end of Makis, the fox is walking out of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, Rabbi Akiva laughs because Rabbi Akiva sees in that desolation things can't really get worse, and if they can't get worse, that has to mean that they're going to get better. And when Rabbi Akiva is being murdered and tortured by the Romans, again, he sees the opportunity to literally love Hashem with all of his life. The godless of Rabbi Akiva was, whatever your circumstances are in life, maximize them. We spend so much time lamenting, that things didn't turn out the way that I wanted. Life should have been this, and I should have had this, and this should have occurred like this. And we might have very legitimate tinus, like very legitimate complaints. The issue is, as we know, lamenting what could have been, should have been, might have been, doesn't get you anywhere. Life is all about maximizing the circumstances you have and not lamenting that which you lack. And that yesod comes from Rabbi Akiva. The reason I'm sharing this is because I really saw this in Rabbi Akiva's words. Rabbi Akiva says, "Karka kol shu chai b'peah." You only have a little bit of land, you still have to give. Maximize what you have. I got it. You're right. Maybe you think you're an ani yourself. Maybe you think you don't have enough. Whatever you have, share with someone else. Whatever you have, bring bikurim. Give with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Whatever the circumstances, be it financial, emotional, spiritual, whatever your circumstances are, make the most of them. The Kosvin Alav Pruzbal. All right, to Pruzbal. Remember again, Pruzbal. Rashi quotes from the Gemara Maseches Gittin. Rashi says, "Hillel tikin Pruzbal sheras." Remember again. Let's just say this outside. Hillel saw that with the coming of the Shemitah year, people stopped lending money, because remember again, Shemitah cancels debts. Now, obviously, this was incredibly detrimental because it stifled the loan market. So Hillel created this concept called Pruzbal, where essentially a person goes ahead and hands their debt over to Beis Din. Shemitah only cancels privately held debt, doesn't cancel Beis Din held debt. However, again, in order to be able to avail yourself of this Pruzbal, your debt has to be secured. The debt has to be secured by real estate, by real property. Because again, normally under general circumstances, debts were always secured by real property. And therefore, again, if you had a debt that wasn't secured by real property, this is like a yotzim in a cloud. This was an abnormal case. And Hillel only legislated for normal cases. So therefore, but again, all you need is a small little bit of karka, and that is going to be enough. We'll say, so we'll say similarly again. Halacha, we have this concept, and Rashi also calls it Kiddushin, that movable property could be acquired together with immovable property, with real property. So in other words, I could acquire, if I'm acquiring land, I could also acquire, for example, the plow along with it. Remember, we saw this machlokes. Does the metaltal, does movable property have to be tziburin? Does it have to be on the piled on the land? Not piled on, we paskin it doesn't have to be piled on the land. So once again, even a very small piece of real property could acquire movable property. Because remember again, the chap of this is that normally movable property requires meshicha or hagbah. Right, it really requires like either lifting it or pulling it towards you. But like this, you could acquire karka even with just kesef or with chazaka. So when you do one of these proprietary acts on karka, it allows you to go ahead and acquire movable property as well. And again, any amount of movable property, any amount of karka works for this. Okay, so the Gemara says, so the Gemara says, so point over here is, what do you see? You have Rabbi Akiva saying that even the smallest amount of karka ultimately is chayiv in bikurim. Now what that means is, bepashtos, I could have an olive tree planted on a very small piece of property. Now what that would seem to say is that Rabbi Akiva is sanctioning a case where my roots are growing into someone else's field, and yet again, I'm not a gazlon, all right? I'm not a thief, and I'm allowed to bring bikurim. That contradicts ula. To which the Gemara says, no, halchama askinan. We'll say second line from the top on 27b. What's the case here? Bidechiti. We're talking about wheat. Dekanami diktani. The Gemara says this also becomes clear. Why? What does it say? Kol shehu. Because it says kol shehu. It says any amount. Any amount. And obviously, again, first of all, wheat, in general, wheat is only going to grow downwards. It's not going to grow sidewards. And all you need is a very little bit of land. Shmamina, okay, Sefer can't bring a raya. Tashma, Elon mitzasa ba'aretz, u'mitzasa b'chutz la'aretz. This is an incredible case. What if you have a tree, and the tree literally straddles the border between Eretz Yisroel and chutz la'aretz? So what's the halacha? Now, the shaila is, what's the status of the produce? So what does the Gemara say? Tevel v'chulim me'uravin zeba zeh divrei Rabbi. Rabbi says that the produce is a mixture of tevel, untithed produce, and chulin, which means produce that is not subject to tithing at all. Because remember, again, produce that grows outside of Eretz Yisrael is not subject to anything. So therefore, again, so Rabbi suggests that the produce here is a combination. Rabbi Shmuel says, Hagodlo b'chiyev chayiv, hagodlo b'pater pater. Interesting. Rabbi Shmuel essentially says that halacha l'maisa, we view the fruit on the chutz la'aretz side of the tree as exempt from tithes, and the produce that grows on the Eretz Yisrael side of the tree obligated in tithes. Someone says, "Ad kan lo pligi ela demar sava yesh breira, mar sava ein breira." Seba says, so we assume that the machlokes is yesh breira. Is there such a thing as retroactive clarification or not? And that's the point of contention. Aval godol bepater divrei akol pater, but ultimately, again, that which is growing in the exempt area certainly will be pater. So I'll say, so again, what's the case? But again, don't you have the roots growing both ways? Look at Rashi, almost right across Rashi. The chuli alma hagadol pater pater shim hayu kol shosha v'chutz la'aretz pater v'afilu omei da'ilan b'sok sheishes rei alma le'eretz v'lamina mina aretz yanak. So remember, again, seems to be that again halacha l'maisa, everyone seems to agree that the produce that grows on the chutz la'aretz side is going to be pater. But don't the roots potentially extend into Eretz Yisrael? To which the Gemara says, no. Hacham asking on what's the case? The mafsik sunma. There's actually a subterranean rock. There's a rock that grows under the ground that is embedded under the ground, and therefore Allah Chalamaisa, it ultimately prevents the roots from going to the other side. Incredible. If that's the case, my time with the Rebbe. So what's Rebbe's logic, right? Why does Rebbe say that the produce is tevel and chulin mixed together? It's very interesting. The Gemara says the hadri arvi, because Rebbe holds like this: as much as the root systems are clearly distinct, so again you'll have the chutz la'aretz roots soaking up roots from chutz la'aretz, and the Eretz Yisrael roots soaking up roots from Eretz Yisrael. The nutrients combine in the trunk, and because they combine in the trunk, ultimately, again, therefore, the produce itself is considered to be a combination of both Eretz. It's a mixture of chulin, chutz la'aretz, right, diaspora produce, and tevel, untithed Eretz Yisrael produce. So it's actually quite beautiful. If you think about that, even just like as a profound metaphor, maybe that's the pshat in Eitz Chaim Hi Lamachazikim Ba. Right, we refer to Torah. Torah is a tree of life for those who cling to it. It could also be understood, right? The power of Torah is Eitz Chaim Hi. Why is Torah so profound? Why is Torah so profound? Because whether you're drawing nutrients from Chutz La'aretz or whether you're drawing nutrients from Eretz Yisrael, Lamachazikim Ba, ultimately, again, the kedusha is held inside of the trunk of Torah. You see, Torah spans geographic limitations. This is the famous idea that Piaget's in Parashas Yisro, that the Rebbeinu Shalom purposely gave Torah in the middle of nowhere. Why did Baruch Hu give Torah in the middle of Midbar Sinai? Why not give it in Eretz Yisrael? Because had Baruch Hu given Torah in Eretz Yisrael, we'd have thought that Torah is only accessible here. So the Rebbeinu Shalom gives Torah in the middle of nowhere to show you that Torah is accessible anywhere. So almost you understand that Torah is like this tree that straddles Chutz La'aretz and Eretz Yisrael. So whether you're learning Torah and getting its kedusha, this is coming up from the roots of Chutz La'aretz, or it's coming up from the roots ultimately again of Eretz Yisrael, everything combines in the trunk and produces the beautiful fruits for Klal Yisrael. This in general is also the further metaphor for Achdus of Klal Yisrael. The nutrients of Klal Yisrael come from many different places, from many different streams. But the beautiful part is that all of the Kedusha remains housed in the trunk of Klal Yisrael. And when Klal Yisrael works together, each of us pumping in our nutrients, our Kedusha from different directions and different ways, we produce beautiful peros, we produce beautiful fruits. So really like a double metaphor, a metaphor of Torah that whether your Torah is coming from Eretz Yisroel, whether your Torah is coming from Chutz La'aretz, wherever your nutrients are coming from, it's all held in the trunk and of Torah. The Torah holds on to all of those nutrients and produces the fruit. And on a chizuk level, or I should say on an achdus level, whether you're contributing from Chutz La'aretz, whatever way you're contributing, or you're contributing from Eretz Yisrael, whatever way you're contributing to the collective, ultimately those nutrients are stored in the trunk and produce beautiful piros for Klal Yisrael. So what's the argument? What's Rabbi and Rabbi Shmuel arguing about? To which the Gemara says, Mar Savra Avira Mebalbal, Umar Savra Hailu Chodei V'Hailu Chodei. So it's actually interesting. Their machlokes is in trunk dynamics. That's their machlokes. Do the nutrients get mixed together ultimately again in the trunk, or do they remain separate and distinct? So the Gemara says, fine, that's the machlokes. Now is that to say that the root system only extends 16 amas and no more? Is that true? But we learned but yet we learned that you distance a tree from a pit 25 amas, which sounds like that the roots extend 25 amas, not 16 amas. To which the Gemara says, To which Abai says, you're right. The roots, we saw this already in yesterday's daf, the roots extend a very far way. That's for sure. But the roots only derive nourishment from this first 16 amos of roots. So again, you could cut off anything after 16. They're only soaking up nutrients in the first 16 amos of the root system. All right. So we'll say, so another version of this, if I have a tree and the tree is 16 within 16 amos of my friend's boundary, so the Gemara says, Mahu. So he asked Rabbi Yochanan, what status the tree? Rabbi Yochanan said, Amarlei Gazlanhu vein mavim bikurim. Such a person is a thief because he's stealing nutrients from his friend's field, and you can't bring bikurim from such a tree. Ki asa Ravin Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Echad ilan hasamach l'meitzar, ve'echad ilan hanota, maybe Vikore. This is incredible. So Ravin came along, he's saying Rabbi Yochanan, whether you have a tree that is close to your friend's border, or you have a tree that overhangs, nota, a tree that over Rashi says, no, my branch extends into over my friend's field, then what's the halacha? Maybe Vikore. Bring Bikurim, and we read the associated readings. Why? Shalminas Kain Hinchil Yoshua Li Yisrael Esares. This is so beautiful. For on this condition, this is how Yoshua caused Klal Yisrael, or I should say, these are the rules upon which inheritance in Eretz Yisrael was predicated. Rashi says, Shalminas Kain Hinchil Yoshua Hisna Imoim Sholiach Pidu Al Kach. This is so beautiful. Let's about first the halacha. So now we'll say a totally different stream. So Rabbi Yochanan argues on Ula and said, you are allowed to put your tree right next to the border of your field, even though the root system is going to grow into your friend's field. You can also go ahead. Now, by the way, I am allowed to do that. Now, of course, my friend is also, if he's allowed to dig down 3 tvachim to remove the roots so it doesn't get caught on his plow. He's also allowed to dig even deeper if he wants to dig a pit, right? So ultimately, again, there are these other qualifications. But halacha l'maisa, I'm allowed to put my put my tree right next to my friend's field. Not only that, but even if my branch overhangs into my friend's field, that's okay also. Again, assuming it's not causing any damage. Now, what's the logic? Because when Yoshua orchestrated the inheritance of Eretz Yisroel, he orchestrated it with a certain understanding of certain basic interpersonal rules. And one of those rules, Rabbi Yochanan posits, is that people should not be makbid on each other. That again, for something that is not actively causing damage right now, it's not doing anything, let it go. Let it go. So fundamental machlok is Rabbi Yochanan and Ula. Who do we paskin like? So amazingly enough, the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Yochanan. That halacha l'maisa, again, I'm allowed to plant my tree right next to my friend's field, even though my root system is going to extend into his field. Why? Because this was the condition with which Yoshua allowed us to inherit Eretz Yisrael. And I will say, there is such a profound Musa Haskell in this as well. If you look at the Lashon of Rashi, his neimaim, Yoshua says, Eretz Yisrael is yours as long as what? Shalo yakpidu al kach. As long as we are not makpid on each other, as long as we are mevater, as long as we are yielding. Makpid means, you hold everyone accountable for everything, right? And ultimately, I'm makpid on this. I don't know what the good English word for makpid is. I'm makbid, I'm meticulous with this, exacting, that's the word, exacting or demanding of this. Yoshua says, Chavra, if you want Eretz Yisroel, you can't be makbid on every single thing that every person does. You have to learn to be a vatron. You have to learn to be forgiving. You have to learn to be yielding. That is the only way that Eretz Yisroel works. It is the only way that Am Yisrael works. If we hold each other to the highest standard, and we're so demanding and meticulous with one another, no one could survive that level of scrutiny, that level of judgment, and that's where there's dissent, and that's where there's machlokas, and that's where there's all kinds of negativity. Yoshua said, if you want Eretz Yisrael, it only works if you're not makbid on each other. Wow. A lesson that was good for Yoshua and a profound lesson for us today as well. Mishnah. Let's finish the parak. Mishnah. Ilan shunot l'sadeh chavera. This is what we just spoke about before. So, right, if my tree extends into my friend's field, kol tzeitz malei hamardea al gabe macharisha. So again, my friend is my tree extends into Reuven's field. So now there's overhang there. So Reuven could cut back the branches so that there's enough clearance for him to go on his plow, with his goad extended. Ubecharov ubeshikma kineged mishkalos. Now here's this interesting. When it comes to a sycamore tree or a carob tree, you could cut off all the overhanging branches using a plumb line. In other words, the plumb line, remember, measures a straight line down. So halacha l'maisa, again, you could essentially go to the border, use a plumb line, and cut everything off. Now, why can you cut everything off? Rashi points out over here, because again, these trees provide an incredible amount of shade, and that's actually detrimental to the growth of anything on the field. All right, very interesting. Beis HaShalchin, good. Beis HaShalchin, what happens if it's an irrigated field? So remember again, up until now we were dealing with a field that was sustained by rainwater. What happens if halacha l'maisa again? What happens if halacha l'maisa it's an irrigated field? Kol ha'ilon keneged ha'mishkalos. Then you could cut back any tree, right, using the plumb line. You could cut back all branch overhang. Rabbi Shmuel says, Kol ilon srak keneged ha'mishkalos. And Rabbi Shmuel says any barren tree, anything that's not a fruit tree, you could use the plumb line and you could always cut back all of the branches. Okay, incredible. Let's analyze. What is Rabbi Shmuel commenting on? Is he commenting on the first case, which is more like a rain field, or is he commenting on the second case, which is the irrigated field? So the Gemara says, Tashma, the Sanya Beis HaShalchin, when it comes to an irrigated field, Rabbi Shmuel Omer Kol Ilan Keneged HaMishkalos. Rabbi Shmuel says every tree could be cut, branches could be cut according to the plumb line. Why? Because ultimately, again, because halacha l'maisa, shade is bad for a beis hashalchin. Okay. Good. Fine. Shade is bad for beis hashalchin. Shmamina, areisha kai shmamina. So therefore you see that ultimately, again, so Abba Shal is commenting on the first case, not the second. Amr Rav Ashi, Masnisin Namideka, Bryce also, so our Mishnah also supports this Tiktani called Ilan Srak. He says any tree that doesn't bear fruit. If it's talking about the Reisha, Hainu Tiktani called Ilan. That's why it says all trees. But if it's talking about the Seifa, Ilan Srak mi baile, then ultimately again, why do you need to mention Ilan Srak? So Allah Shmamina Reisha Kai Shmamina. Okay, so we'll say so bottom line, Abayi statement in the Mishnah. Ultimately, again, it's going on the Reisha. Incredible. We'll say last Mishnah of the parak. Ilan shunot ve'osharabim kotzitz kadeshi agamal over v'rochbo. So also a very interesting case. Tanakam says the following. Now we're transitioning a little bit from a tree overhang into a private field to a tree overhang. Ultimately, again, to a public field, or I should say a public thoroughway, right? Or Rosh Hashanah. So the Gemara says as follows. So we'll say, I just want to point out, but in the previous Mishnah, the tree overhang, we're talking about cases over here where the shade is detrimental. Because going back to what Yoshua said, if the shade doesn't really matter, in other words, if the shade's not impacting and the person's not planting anything there, so one would probably leave it alone. But Lamaisa, again, if the shade is having a negative impact, then Halach Lamaisa, one is permitted to go ahead and cut it back. Fine. So now, the tree is overhanging into Rosh Hashanah. So now, how much are you allowed to cut it back? Kadeshi Gamal over V'rochbo, in order that a camel could pass by with the camel together with its rider on top. Rabbi Huda says, Gamal ta'un pishtan o chavile zmuros. So Rabbi Huda said that ultimately, again, Rabbi Huda said that halacha l'maisa, the gamal, the camel, ultimately, you have to cut it back enough for a camel holding flax or bundles of reeds. Okay, so either way, you're allowing for some kind of clearance. Is machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about what level of clearance? So the Gemara goes right there. Rabbi Shimon, sorry. Oh, Rabbi Shimon, that was Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon, so Tanakama says that halacha l'maisa, if you have a tree overhanging into Rosh Hashanah, first opinion, you have to cut back the tree's branches enough to allow a camel and its rider to go through. Rabbi Yehuda says enough to allow a laden camel with either flax or vines, or a bundle of vines. Rabbi Shimon says, Kala ilan kinegam mishkal something out tuma. It's very interesting. Rabbi Shimon says, any tree that extends into Rosh Hashanah, you're always allowed to cut it back. Again, I will say, an alignment with the plumb line means you run the plumb line essentially down the border of the Rosh Hashanah, and anything that extends into the Rosh Hashanah, you are allowed, or to Rosh Hashanah, you're allowed to cut back. Why? Because of Tumah. Because of Tumah. We'll see what it means in the Gemara. Zok the Gemara. Man tanad b'ni zakin Basra umduna dahashtaz linan. So I will say, here's what's interesting. Who is the opinion that says that when it comes to damages, we look at the here and now? Now, what does this mean? What does this mean? Now, here's what's interesting, right? So let's analyze this. I have a tree. I own a tree, and my tree extends into the Rosh Hashanah. So now, the Mishnah talks about how much how much are we allowed to cut back that tree so that it shouldn't impede in the Rosh Hashanah. They're both saying, interestingly enough, one thing we know for sure, which is, even though you cut back that tree, the branches are going to grow back. So it's interesting. The halacha doesn't say, you know what, Silber, you got to cut down your tree because it's going to keep posing a problem for Rosh Hashanah. Rather, what we do is we cut back the branches and we'll keep cutting them back as much as necessary. Who is the opinion that says that we deal with damages in the here and now and don't think about the future? So Amrish Lakish Machlokis ne Rabbi Lazar, this Machlokis and Rabbi Lazar, this nan ein osin chalatachas Rabbi Borosichnu Ma'aros. So listen to this. The Mishnah says as follows. In general, you can't dig underneath a Rosh Hashanah. The Tanakama says, Rabbanan say, you can't dig underneath a Rosh Hashanah. So you can't make a subterranean, bar, a pit, or a siach, or a water cistern, or a cave. Why? Because again, what's going to happen over time is the ground, the Rosh Hashanah, is going to give way. Rabbi Lazar says, Matir b'chtei agala mahaleches u'tu'una avanim. Rabbi Lazar says you can, as long as you cover it in a way that the covering is strong enough to allow a wagon, ultimately again carrying stones to go ahead and go over it. So as long as there is enough to allow that, and then that is fine. Rabbi Yochanan says, so the point over here is, what do you see from here? So the Tanakama says, you're not allowed to do something that could potentially create damaging force later on. Yet Rabbi Eliezer says, it's fine as long as you alleviate the potential damage. Now, that cover could get wormy, could erode, could disintegrate. We're not worrying about it. We'll worry about it when we have to worry about it. We're not worrying about it now. Rabbi Yochanan says, therefore again, we're saying that the opinion of our Mishnah that says you just cut back the branches, so therefore to avoid any type of disturbance, even though I know they're going to go ahead and grow back, seems to reflect the view of Rabbi Eliezer. To which the Gemara says, no. Afilu Rabbanan. Our Mishnah even reflects the view of the Rabbanan. How so? Hasam zimnin de mafchis falavadaite hacha kama kakayitzlei. Here's the difference. The Rabbanan hold in the case of the covering in the Rosh Hashanah, because sometimes, again, that covering could go bad. That covering could go bad, right? That covering could rot, and a person might not be aware of it until chas v'shalom something happens. Masha came with the branches, you see the branches, and therefore you're acutely aware whenever they have to be cut back. Incredible. Let's go back to Rabbi Yehuda. So remember again, Rabbi Yehuda gave the shear for branches that hang into the Rosh Hashanah, that you have to cut it back enough space for a laden camel to walk through. So the Gemara says, Iboilu, shir Rabbi Yehuda nafish, or dilma shir Rabbanan nafish. So we'll say, here's what's interesting, right? So the Mishnah is dealing with the same case. The Mishnah is dealing with the case of, I have a tree, my tree overhangs into the Rosh Hashanah. So the first opinion said, Tanakama said, that Allah you have to cut it back for enough space for a camel with a rider to pass through it, to pass under it. Rabbi Yehuda says enough space for a camel laden with flax or with a bundle of vines. So is Rabbi Yehuda a smaller shear or a larger shear? Which one is it? So Pshita, the Shud Rabbanan Nafish. It would appear obvious that the shear of the Rabbanan is the greater shear. In other words, you have to cut off more branches to allow for a clearance for a camel with a rider. Then you need ultimately again for a laden camel. Because if you think that Rabbi Yehuda has the greater shear, then Rabbanan b'shir Rabbi Yehuda hechi avdi, right? So ultimately, again, what will the Rabbanan do with the shear Rabbi Yehuda? Ve'elamai shear the Rabbanan nafish. So rather, I must see that the shear of the Rabbanan is greater. Rabbi Yehuda b'shir, which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda b'shir the Rabbanan, my avid. Efshar the gachin v'chalif tusei. So we'll say. So therefore, it turns out that halacha l'maisa, the way the Mishnah works is as follows: the greatest shears the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan say you have to cut back their branches on the private tree hanging through Sharabim with enough clearance for a camel with its rider to go through. That's a high shear. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, I don't need that much. Right? I don't need that much. I just need enough for a laden camel to go through. What about the rider? Rabbi Yehuda says, bend down. Bend down. Right, that's it. So the rider could bend his head a little bit and he'll be able to go through. He'll be just fine. Incredible. Tremendous. Moshe and Rabbi Yehuda also. Moshe, sometimes in life we encounter circumstances, we encounter branches, and we want those branches to cater to us. We want those branches to move aside for us. And Rabbi Yehuda says sometimes the yesod in life is that I have to bend in front of the branches. Sometimes the branches don't bend for you. You have to bend in front of the branches. Again, sometimes the circumstances in life do cater to me, but more often than not, kind of going back to what we were saying before, like Rabbi Akiva, the circumstances are the circumstances. The branches are the branches. So you can either choose to ignore them and get smacked in the face, or deal with them and sometimes figure out how to contort, how to maneuver, and how to pivot in order to get through them. Incredible. Rabbi Shimon says, "Kala ilan keneged amashkolos neatuma." So Rabbi Shimon comes along. Rabbi Shimon says, "No. In general, you cut away all overhanging branches into the Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because of tuma. Now, the Gemara says, what does that mean? It's actually interesting. Tana, mipnei ola tuma. It's because of oil. What are we concerned about? Watch this. Now, remember, branches could form an ohel, could form an overhanging structure. As such, if there is a tummy item underneath those branches, and I'm standing there under those same branches, I could become tamis. Let's say a person passes away underneath the tree, and then I stand under the tree with the mace. That is tumas ohel. I'm under the quote unquote the same roof with the mace, and therefore I become tamei. So therefore, the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says that Rabbi Shimon is saying that therefore you have to cut back the branches in order that you shouldn't have any potential tumas ohel, no overhang, no roof into the Surabim, and therefore not inadvertently making passerbys tamei. So pshita, mipnei tumatanam, that's obvious. Okay, I got it. That's what the Mishnah said. In other words, what else would it mean? It's actually very interesting. Ima masnis and hava amina, dilma maisi oref tuma, v'shadi hasam, v'sage b'dechaluli ba'alma. Listen to this. I'm going to thought maybe the issue is like this. Maybe we're concerned that a raven is going to bring something tamei, and the raven is going to go ahead and settle in the branches and leave the tummy item in the branches. And that's the concern. Now again, it's still the same net effect that I'm going to be under the same roof with an item of tumah, and therefore again I'm going to run into a problem, and therefore Allah Chalamais again cut back the branches. But in that case, you don't really have to cut back, you don't have to cut off all the branches. What you just have to do is you have to thin the branches out enough so that the raven won't nest there. So it would require less of a clearing. Kamash Molan, the Gemara says, no, that's not the issue. The issue is that branches form a roof, and I'm concerned that should I be under that same canopy, that same tree canopy, as a tamei item, depending on the type of tumah, I could also become tamei. Therefore again, Rabbi Shimon says, halacha l'maisa, you have to cut back the entire canopy, overhanging canopy, in order to avoid any potential tumas. Rabbi says, shkoyach hadron alach lo yachpor mazel tov. Looking forward to beginning Cheskas Sabat V'Emeretz Hashem tomorrow. Wishing everyone a wonderful day.